A pregnant widow was locked out of her home in a blizzard. A rancher broke the frozen padlock. The padlock wouldn't give. I'd been at it maybe 2 minutes, working the heel of my hand against the shackle, and already I couldn't feel my fingers proper. The cold had that particular quality it gets in the high country in February, not just cold, but mean about it, like it had a grievance. The wind was coming sideways off the ridge, and every gust threw ice crystals that found the gap between your collar and your jaw and settled there like they'd always belonged. My breath came out in bursts that the wind took immediately, scattered them into nothing before they'd even formed. She was standing about 3 feet behind me. I could hear her breathing, short, controlled, the way a person breathes when they are working hard not to come apart. I didn't look back, didn't want to embarrass her, and didn't want to see what I was already imagining. A woman 8 months along in a coat that wasn't built for this weather, standing in snow up past her boot tops, the lamplight from the Greer place across the road too far off to do anything useful except remind her how alone she was on this particular piece of ground. I had a flat rock from her porch step in my left hand. Good weight to it, one solid corner. I turned the padlock so the keyhole faced down. You do that. Let gravity work against the ice that's packed itself into the mechanism, and I set my feet and I swung. First hit loosened something. Second hit I felt give somewhere inside. Third hit the shackle jumped but didn't release. Fourth hit, the whole frozen mechanism came apart in my palm, not dramatically, just a quiet surrender, the kind of thing that's been holding out against you and decides it's finished. There, I said. That was all I said. I pushed the door open, stepped to the side, and she went in past me. My name is Callum Reese. I run 400 acres on the North Slope, about a mile from where Clara Aldridge's land starts, or started anyway. The boundary markers had got complicated after her husband died in October, and I hadn't pushed on sorting them out because it hadn't seemed like the moment. Reuben Aldridge, good man, steady and quiet and not the kind to make enemies or headlines. He'd been a careful rancher, careful about his fences, careful about his animals, careful about the people he owed and the people who owed him. He had a way of doing a thing slowly and right the first time that I'd always respected from a distance, because it's the way I try to do things myself, and I know what it costs. He'd gone out in early October to fix a section of fence along the creek draw during the first hard freeze of autumn, and his horse had come back without him. They found him face down in the mud the next morning with the wire stretcher still in his hand. Heart, the doctor figured. He was 41 years old. I hadn't known them well. You know people the way you know your neighbors in a place as spread out as that valley. You wave from the road. You help pull a wagon out of a mud hole when it happens. You say a few words at the feed store. You learn their shapes at a distance and file them away as solid. Clara Aldridge was a slight dark-haired woman with a steady way of looking at you when she talked. The kind of look that wasn't rude but wasn't soft either, just direct, like she'd decided at some point not to waste energy looking at things sideways. I'd spoken maybe 100 words to her total across 2 years of neighboring, and half of those were at the funeral in October, where there wasn't much to say that did any good, and I'd stood in the back and left early. What I knew was what everyone in the valley knew. She was alone, she was pregnant, the baby was due in March. What I thought about that wasn't my business, and I left it there. The night it happened was a Thursday. I know because I'd been into Harlan's Ferry on Wednesday for wire and feed, and on the ride back I'd looked at the sky and not liked what I saw. That particular low, greenish-gray that sits on the mountains when something serious is building, the old-timers called it a wolf sky. You've got 12 hours, maybe 14 if you're lucky, and then whatever the sky has been saving up arrives all at once. I got home, got the horses settled in the big barn with extra hay, pulled the tarp tight over the woodpile, and laid 2 days' worth of split wood on the porch under cover. Got the water barrels filled, did all of it in the last light, and went to bed feeling squared away, which is the best you can feel going into weather like that. By morning it was a full blizzard. 20 inches on the level before noon, and the wind driving it into drifts that made the familiar look wrong. My fence line along the north pasture, which I knew every post and wire of, had disappeared entirely under something that looked like a range of low hills. The world went white and loud and close. The mountains had been there yesterday, and now there was just white where they'd been, like someone had rubbed them out. I stayed in. I had harnessed to work on a collar that had split its seaming along one side, and there's a particular contentment to indoor work on a day like that. The stove hot and the wind making its noise outside, and you with your hands occupied and know where you need to be. I worked on the harness through the morning, ate lunch, started in on a length of trace that had been needing new rivets since November. It was coming on 3 in the afternoon when I heard it. Not much, just a sound at the edge of the storm noise, something that didn't belong. The wind has its own vocabulary. It talks in long notes and short ones, in the particular bang of a loose shutter and the low moan around the chimney, and you get so you hear it without hearing it. But this was different, something sharper. I set down the riveting iron and stood still in the middle of my kitchen and waited. There again, from the south, or what I was guessing was south through that curtain of white. I put on my coat. She was at the edge of my drive where my track meets the county road. She'd walked a mile through a blizzard. Her wool coat was dark with melted snow across the shoulders, and her boots were so packed with it I don't know how she was moving her feet. She was carrying a canvas bag that sagged heavy to one side, clothes in it, I figured, and maybe some food. And her face, when she turned it toward me, had that particular stillness you see in people who have been scared for a long time and have used up everything they had for showing it. Nothing left over for performance. Just the fact of it plain. "Mr. Reese," she said, "my key broke off in the lock. I can't get in." She said it the way you say a thing you've been rehearsing during a mile of difficult walking. Flat and clear, no apology in it, no drama. A fact presented to someone who might be able to do something about it. "Come inside first," I said. She started in on not wanting to be a trouble, and I said her name, Clara, first time I'd used it, and I said come inside. And she did. I put her in the chair closest to the stove and put water on, and I didn't make a production of any of it. Didn't ask too many questions, didn't fuss around her, didn't look at her belly in that way people look when they're calculating distances and timelines. Let her warm up in peace. She had a cut on the heel of her right hand from working at the lock with something sharp before she gave up. I noticed it when she set the canvas bag down on my floor, and I let it alone for the moment. She told me what had happened. She'd gone out early that morning to check on her chickens before the storm got serious, and the wind had blown her door shut behind her. The key was old iron, already cracked from years of use in that lock, and it had snapped clean off when she tried to turn it. Half the key was still in the keyhole. She tried for an hour in the cold to work it out with a hairpin she'd pulled from her hair. Then she'd gone through the storm to the Greers, to the east. Nobody home. Ed Greer's wagon was gone from the barn. Probably they'd gone to his sister's before the weather hit. Then she'd come north. She said it all without stopping and without the kind of emotion that asks for a response. And when she was done, she sat there with her hands in her lap and her face turned toward the stove, and I could see the effort she was making, the small, precise work of keeping herself together in someone else's kitchen. "My things are inside," she said after a moment. "The things for the baby." She didn't say it with panic. She said it like she was taking inventory of a problem, adding up its weight. I asked her if she'd eaten since morning. She said just breakfast. I put bread and cold roast beef on the table, and she ate without being asked twice, which told me something about her. She wasn't going to let pride get in the way of what she needed. That's a particular kind of toughness that doesn't get talked about enough. When the color had come back into her face, I got a clean cloth and a little warm water, and without making anything of it, I reached across and cleaned the cut on her hand. She let me. Didn't pull away, didn't thank me extravagantly, just sat still while I did it and looked at the wall. I put a strip of clean cotton around it and tied it off, and that was that. I asked her about the lock, what kind, what size. She described it, a brass padlock, old make, the style with the long shackle. I had a pick set and a flat rock, and I'd opened worse. I told her we'd go when the wind dropped. She nodded, and something in the set of her shoulders changed, just slightly, a fraction of an inch, like a rope that's been pulled taut for a long time and has just been given a half-turn of slack. We waited out the worst of it. 4 hours, maybe a little more. I'm not precise about it because I wasn't watching the clock. I banked the stove and sat at the table and we talked, and I want to be honest about what that was like because it wasn't what I expected, which I suppose says something about what I'd expected. I'd thought it would be an obligation, filling time politely with someone I didn't know well, taking careful steps around the sorrow in the room. It wasn't like that. She asked me about the harness I'd been working on, and I showed her the split collar and the beeswax and the curved needles and the kind of stitch I'd been using, and she watched with attention that was real, not polite. The kind where a person's eyes go to where the work is, not to your face. She asked me about the thread weight and why I'd chosen it over a heavier gauge, and the question was right, the kind of question that tells you someone knows what they're looking at. Her father had kept mules in Missouri, she said. She'd grown up watching him work leather. I asked what part of Missouri. The western part, she said, below the river country. She'd met Reuben when he'd come through with a cattle drive in the late spring of '78, and she'd thought he was the most straightforward man she'd ever encountered, which she'd decided was worth more than all the fancy ones she'd known. She said this plainly, without grief in it, the way you say something that is true and finished. I said I'd never been to Missouri. She said there wasn't much reason to go, unless you had people there. There was something dry in how she said it, not quite humor, not quite bitterness, but in the neighborhood of both, with a little distance on it, and I laughed, which surprised me some. I don't laugh easy, and I generally don't do it when I'm not expecting to. She looked at me, that direct look of hers, just for a second. But it was different from the look at the road. The road look had been stripped down to nothing, survival level. This was something else. Behind it, something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite warmth but was in the vicinity of both, like a window in a room that doesn't usually have one. Then she looked back at her hands, and we talked about other things. The wind dropped around 6. I could hear it in the way the house stopped its particular ticking and straining. The silence that comes after a blizzard is its own kind of sound, huge and close at once, the world muffled under all that white. I got the lantern and we went. The walk was slow going. A mile in deep snow at last, light, breaking trail through drifts that were unpredictable in the way blizzard drifts, are bare ground in one spot, chest high in the next, the surface sometimes crusted and holding weight and sometimes punching through without warning. I went first and kept my pace to hers without making anything of it. Behind me, I could hear her boots working, steady and deliberate, and she didn't ask me to slow and didn't rush, just worked through it the way you work through something that can't be hurried. We came down off the high ground and crossed the flat along the creek drainage, which was bad. The wind had piled it deep here, and the creek ice was somewhere under there, and you couldn't see it. I found the firm line along the north bank and took it slow, and she stayed in my tracks and we got through. On the far side the ground rose again toward her place, and the going got better. Her house sat back off the road about 200 yards. I'd seen it a dozen times from the road and a few times closer. Once when I'd helped Reuben pull a jammed post out of the frozen ground, the spring after they'd moved in. A solid house, well-built, low-pitched roof with good overhang. Reuben's work. The barn to the left, well-kept, and the chicken coop to the right where I could already hear the birds complaining in that ruffled, indignant way chickens complain about weather. They're not stoic about it. I always liked that about them. The door was exactly as she described. The key's broken half was barely visible in the keyhole, dark with rust. The padlock was there below the latch, and I could see the frost rhyming the shackle, and the keyway, packed in solid, probably had water work its way inside and freeze. I tried the pick first just to see. 5 minutes, 6. The ice was too far gone for it. I found the flat rock on the porch step, good weight and a square corner on it, and I worked the shackle into position with the keyhole down, and I swung. The first hit rang out sharp in the cold air. The second. The third, the shackle jumped. The fourth, it gave. I pushed the door open and stepped to the side. She went in. I stood in the doorway while she got a lamp lit. The house was cold inside, not blizzard cold. The walls had held against that, but deep cold, the kind that soaks into things. I could smell the particular smell of a house that has been waiting. Something dried and herbal, maybe lavender she'd hung in the summer, and underneath it the residue of wood smoke and something baked. The lamp flared and caught, and I could see the room. A kitchen, a table with 2 chairs, a broad shelf with her provisions lined up neat, a rocking chair near the back wall, and in the far corner a crib, solid pine, new cut, the kind you build yourself over a number of evenings, taking your time with the joints. Reuben had built it. I knew it without asking, the same way you know a man's work when you've watched him long enough from a distance. The proportions of it, the care in it. She turned from the lamp and looked at me from across the room. "Will you come in?" she said, "please." Not a question, not quite. The kind of please that has some authority in it. The kind that means, I am asking you to let me do something for you, and I mean it. I came in, pulled the door closed behind me. She had the stove going in less time than I'd have figured. She knew where everything was, and her hands were certain about it. No hesitation, no fumbling for matches in the wrong drawer. I sat at her table and watched her work, and I thought about what it takes to be what she was being right then. Not what it was costing her. What it took. There's a difference that matters. The water heated. She made coffee and put a cup in front of me, and sat down across the table and put her hands flat on the wood and looked at me. "I want to ask you something," she said. I waited. "When Reuben died," she said, "I thought about leaving, going back to Missouri. My sister's there, she's got a good husband and enough room, and she'd have had me. I thought about it every day for a solid month, packed a bag twice, unpacked it twice." She looked down at her hands and then back up. "I stayed because this is where he is, and because he built things here and I wanted to see them stand." She paused. "But I've been doing the arithmetic since October, and the arithmetic doesn't always add up. This baby is coming in March, and I can do that. I've got Mrs. Greer, and I've got the doctor in town if the roads are clear. That part I can manage." She stopped, started again. "What I can't quite manage is everything else. The fence in spring. The well, it's been slow since November. The barn roof, there's a purlin showing daylight. Reuben's list, it was a long list, and he was one man who was good at all of it." She looked at me steadily. "I'm not asking for charity. I can work. I can trade. I can be a fair neighbor, but I need." She stopped again, which was unusual for her, the stopping. She was a woman who said things direct. "I need to know there's someone who'll come when I knock," she said. I didn't know how much I needed to know that until today. I walked a mile in a blizzard, and I kept walking because I knew there was a direction to walk. If I didn't have that, if I was just walking into white in every direction, she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The stove was ticking, warming up. The lamp threw a yellow ring on the table between us. I said, "I'll come." She looked at me, that look. "I know," she said. "That's why I walked to your place and not south. I want to be honest about what happened between that February night and spring, because it's easy to tell a thing sweeter than it was, and that would be wrong to do to what it actually was. I came the next morning and fixed the lock proper. New brass padlock from my spare stores, a better one, better fit for a cold country door. 2 keys cut. One for her, one hung on a nail inside the barn door where only the 2 of us would know to look. I didn't make a ceremony of it, just showed her the nail and the key and said there it was. I split a week's worth of firewood and stacked it on her porch under the overhang where it'd stay dry. She came out while I was working and brought me coffee and didn't stand over me or make conversation about it. Just set the cup on the step and went back in, and I thought, yes, that's the right way to be about this. Neither of us needed the other to be grateful in a particular direction. I came back 3 days later. The well was slowing because of a crack in the housing that was letting in a little freeze. I repaired it, fixed the purlin in the barn roof, replaced 2 boards in the chicken coop floor that had rotted out. She fed me lunch each time, a good cook, which I noticed the way you notice anything that's genuinely better than you were expecting, and we talked while we ate. We talked about practical things mostly. The section of fence between our properties, which needed new wire in 3 places. Her chickens, which were producing poorly in the cold. Whether the winter would break early or not, I said it wouldn't, based on the way the elk had come down off the high ground in December, which usually means they know something about the months ahead, and she took that seriously instead of telling me I was reading into the behavior of animals. The price of beef futures, which she'd been following in the county paper. She had a head for the practical. She didn't ask to be led through things. She wanted the facts and she'd work it through herself. I respected that enough that I stopped softening information before I gave it to her, stopped leaving out the harder parts. She didn't want that. Slowly, and I mean slowly, the way things happen when 2 people are both being careful, I began to understand the particular shape of her. She was funny in a way that didn't announce itself. She'd say something and you'd almost miss it, and then you'd catch it 2 seconds later and it was exactly right, sharp-edged and dry, and she'd already moved on to the next thing. She'd been raising chickens since she was 7 years old and had opinions about them, not fanciful opinions, practical ones. And she could talk about the different characters of individual birds with more specificity than most people talk about people. She'd read more than she let on and didn't show it off. She was patient, and she was stubborn in equal proportions, and the combination of the 2 was formidable. And she was lonely. Not in a way she'd ever have said, not in a way she was asking me to fix, but I could see it in the particular way she'd extend a conversation about something small, the price of wire, the behavior of the rooster, the question of what grass seed to put in the south pasture, just a few more minutes than it needed to go. She'd been alone since October, and it was now February, and the arithmetic of that kind of alone adds up. I don't know when I started looking for reasons to go back. I know at some point I stopped needing them. There's a particular quality to a Montana winter in the high country, the way March lies to you. The days start lengthening and the light changes and you think, almost. You think the back of it is broken. And then a late storm comes in off the divide and reminds you it was never finished saying what it had to say. The late storm came the first week of March. Not a blizzard, just a steady, serious snow that went on for 2 days and left another 1.5 feet and put the temperature back below 0 at night. I'd been over to Clara's the afternoon before it arrived, looking at the fence situation, walking the line between our properties with her so we could make a list of what we'd need in the way of wire and posts when the ground thawed. She was moving careful by then, 8.5 months, carrying it all in front of her, had developed a particular way of turning so she could see things to her side that I'd started to find, privately, very fine. There's a kind of dignity in a body that's doing what bodies are built for. She had it. We walked the fence line, and she took notes in a small pocket journal with a stub of pencil, and she asked good questions, and I answered them. When we got back to her barn and she was writing up the final count of posts we'd need, she stopped and looked at me with a kind of weighing look she sometimes had, measuring something. "You've been coming around a good deal," she said. "There's been a good deal to do," I said. "There has," she agreed. She wrote something in the journal, Callum. She hadn't used my given name much, just when she meant to. "I'm not a woman who does things halfway," she said. "And I'm not a woman who lets things get unclear when they don't have to be unclear. So I'm going to say something directly and you can take it or leave it." I waited. I think you're a good man, she said. I think you're the steadiest thing I've had to count on since October, and I'm aware that's partly circumstance and partly something else. And I think if you keep coming around the way you've been coming around, we're going to end up somewhere, and I'd rather know if that's all right with you before we get there without meaning to. I looked at the notebook in her hand, and the pencil, and the particular kind of cold light that comes through a barn door in early March. It's all right with me, I said. She nodded once, like we'd agreed on the wire count. Good, she said, then come for supper Sunday. The baby came on the 7th of March. I'd been there that afternoon finishing the well housing, which had needed one more repair after the late freeze. She'd come out twice to check on my progress, not to hurry me, just to know where things stood, and the second time she'd stood in the barn door with her arms folded under that enormous front of her and looked at me with an expression I'd learned to read by then, the careful kind, the one where she was holding something back until she was sure of it. I think, she said, you should probably not go home tonight. I set down the tools. She said, Mrs. Greer is already on her way. I sent the boy from the Greer place this morning. This morning, I said. I had a feeling, she said. She turned and went back to the house, and I put my horse in her barn next to her mare and settled them both with hay and water, and I went back to the barn and I sat. I sat in the hay in the dark with my back against the barn wall and my horse blowing beside me in the warm dark, and I didn't try to think too much. When I do try too hard to think, I go in circles, and circles don't help anything. So I just sat and let it be what it was. A cold night in early March. A woman in a house 30 yards away doing the hardest work there is. A man sitting in a barn waiting to find out what kind of world it would be in an hour. Mrs. Greer came at dusk. She'd had to come through the tail of the late storm, and she was cold and businesslike, and told me to stay in the barn, and I did. I could see the lamplight in the bedroom window from where I sat, and once in a while I could see shadows moving across it, and that was all I had. I thought about Reuben Aldridge. I've been thinking about him now and then since October, in the way you think about a man whose ground you're walking on, figuratively speaking. I thought he'd been a good man who'd done right by what he had and built the things he built carefully and then died too young. I thought about whether he'd object to what was happening, and I decided he probably wouldn't. He'd struck me as a practical man. He'd have known what the arithmetic required. I thought about my 400 acres sitting empty a mile north and what I was going to do about that, and I didn't have a clear answer yet, but it didn't feel like a problem exactly. More like a thing to be sorted out in time. I thought about dried lavender. The smell of it in that house the night I'd broken the padlock, the way it had been waiting in the walls, a summer thing, a warm thing, stored up against the cold. Mrs. Greer came out to the barn a little past midnight. She had a lamp, and she held it up so I could see her face. Girl, she said, healthy, both of them fine. I said thank you, and I stood up and brushed the hay off my coat. The lamp was low in the bedroom. Clara was propped up against the headboard with 2 pillows behind her, and she had the baby against her chest with one hand covering the whole back of its head. The baby was very small and her hand was not large, but it covered the whole back of it, and she was looking at the ceiling when I came in, and then she looked at the door. She looked like she'd been through a war and come out the other side. That's the only way I know to say it. Not beaten, the other side, the part where you've come through and you know you have. Hair loose on the pillow, dark against the white. The line of her jaw, which I'd been looking at for a month and a half from various angles, was set and clear even now. Come here, she said. I came to the side of the bed. There wasn't anywhere to sit, so I stood, and I looked at her and she looked at me, and for a moment neither of us said anything, which was fine. Some moments don't need filling. Then she reached out and took my right hand, just reached out and took it. The hand was rough. I'd split the knuckles on that 4th swing back in February, and the scar had healed knotted, and the whole hand was coarser than it should be from 40 years of the kind of work I do. And she took it, and she held it, and she didn't hold it softly. She held it the way you hold something you mean to keep. She looked up at me with that look of hers, not the survival look from the road, not the dry, measuring look. Something behind both of those. The look of a woman who has done the arithmetic, all of it, over a long period of difficulty, and has come out to a number she can stand behind. "Her name is June," she said, "if you're staying." I looked at the baby, at Clara, at the crib in the corner that Reuben had built over a number of evenings, and that was waiting now for what it had been built for. "I'm staying," I said. She held my hand for a long time after that. Didn't let go until the lamp burned down and Mrs. Greer came in to check on things and cleared her throat softly in the doorway. And even then Clara let go slow, finger by finger, like she was counting. That was 6 years ago. June is in the barn most mornings before I am. She's got her mother's way with animals, unhurried, unafraid, that particular quality of paying attention without hovering that animals respond to. She and the old mare have an understanding that I find somewhat humbling, given that the mare and I have been working together for 11 years, and she still pins her ears at me on bad mornings. Clara runs the eggs and the chickens, and she learned leather work properly, the kind her father taught her down in Missouri, the real thing. And now she does all the harness repairs herself except the heavy collar work, which she lets me do partly because it's genuinely hard and partly, I think, because she knows I need something to do that makes me feel useful, and she's generous enough to provide it without making it obvious. We sorted out the property lines in the spring of that first year. Turned out to be straightforward. The surveyors had laid them out well. Reuben's deed was clean. I kept my 400 acres, and she kept hers, and we run them as one operation, and call it the Reese Aldridge Place, which the county assessor finds slightly irregular, and which we have not changed. The fence we talked about that afternoon in February, the long section between our properties, we put in that first spring, the two of us and a hired hand for the post setting. 3 days. June was a few months old by then, and Clara brought her out in a sling, and the three of us worked along the line, and it was ordinary and good, and I don't have better words for it than that. The spare key that I hung on the nail in the barn, I moved it into the house eventually, when it didn't need to be a spare anymore. Clara has the other one. She keeps it on a hook by the door, worn to a shine on the bow of it from handling. Sometimes I come in from the barn and see it hanging there in the morning light, and I don't think much of it. It's just a key on a hook. That's what it is when everything is working right. There's another padlock on the barn now, one I put on when we reorganized the tack room. It's a good one, American-made, solid brass, built for the cold, 2 keys. Clara's got one on her ring. Mine I carry in my left coat pocket, worn smooth on the edges. I could hang it up somewhere, but I don't. Some things you keep on your person not because you need to reach for them constantly, but because it matters to know they're there. I broke that first frozen padlock in February in a blizzard with a rock I'd picked up off a porch step, and it was the right thing to do. I knew it when I swung the first time, not that it would lead to all of this. I wasn't thinking about all of this. I was thinking about a frozen mechanism and what it would take to open it. But I knew it was right. You do a thing and it feels like the correct shape, and you know. There are a handful of moments in a man's life where he does the plain necessary thing, and it turns out to be the whole thing. The seed thing. Everything else grows from it, and you can trace it back, if you want to, and say, there, that morning, that's where it started. I don't trace it back often, but when I do, I come to the same place every time, the fourth swing. The shackle giving, the door opening and her stepping through. I was the man who could do it, and I was there, and so I did. That's usually how it goes, I think, with the things that matter. You don't find them by looking. You find them by being the right man in the right place when the door needs opening. And then you go in. I should say something about what I was before that winter, because it matters to what came after. I'd been on those 400 acres alone for 9 years. Before that, I'd been married Alina, a good woman, a Nebraska woman from a farm family, and we'd had 3 years together that I don't have any complaint about, not one, before she died of a fever in the summer of 1879. We hadn't had children yet. She was 24 years old. I'm not going to say much about those 3 years between Alina dying and when I came up to the Montana Territory. I worked. I moved around. I did what you do when you're trying not to be in one place long enough to feel it. I was not a drunk and I was not vicious and I was not in any particular trouble. I just wasn't anything. I was taking up space and time and waiting, I think, though I wouldn't have called it that. Waiting for what I didn't know. Maybe just waiting for the hurt to go quiet enough that I could hear something else. I found the land in '82. Bought it cheap from a man who tried to run cattle on the North Slope without knowing North Slopes, and I knew North Slopes. I wintered well that first year, built the second barn in the spring, ran beef from the start and did it right. Built the house better than I needed to, twice the room I required, thinking perhaps that was foolish and building it anyway. 9 years alone, I had got settled into myself in a way that has advantages and costs. The advantages: I knew where everything was at all times. I knew what I needed in any situation and I got it and I wasted very little. I knew my own rhythms, when I needed sleep, when I could push, when weather was coming, when an animal was wrong before anything showed on the outside. I trusted my own judgment because there was no one else's to consult, and I'd been right enough times that I'd stopped second-guessing. The cost: I'd stopped expecting much from the company of other people, and that had made me into something a little closed. Not unfriendly, I was civil in town, helped when help was needed, did what neighbors do, but I'd stopped letting anything accumulate. I kept conversations short not because I was rude but because I'd got out of the habit of knowing what to do when they went longer. I hadn't laughed properly in, I don't know, years maybe. There is a particular kind of laugh that comes from being surprised into it, from something getting through a guard you didn't know you had up, and I hadn't had that kind in a long time. When I laughed in my kitchen that February afternoon, when Clara said there wasn't much reason to go to Missouri unless you had people there, I noticed it because of how unfamiliar it felt. Like a door I'd forgotten I'd locked. There was an evening in late February, about 3 weeks after the blizzard, when I came over to look at the well housing and ended up staying until well past dark. Not because of the well, that took an hour, but we'd got talking after supper about something I don't even remember specifically now. The particular way you sometimes get talking when the stove is right, and there's nowhere either of you has to be, and time goes a direction you weren't planning. At some point I looked up, and the window was black. "You should stay," Clara said. She said it the way she said practical things, without build-up. "The road'll be icy by now, and I've got the spare room." The spare room was where the crib was. I said as much. She gave me a look that was not without humor. "You can sleep in there without disturbing the furniture, Callum, I think." I stayed. I slept in the spare room with the crib in the corner and the smell of new pine in the dark, and in the morning she made coffee before I was up, and it was on the table when I came out, and neither of us made anything of it. On the ride home, I thought about the crib. The care and the joinery, you could see it up close, how he'd cut the mortises clean and fitted the tenons with a little beeswax for the seasonal movement, the kind of thing you do when you're building something you mean to last. He'd thought about that crib for months, I'd guess. Probably started the drawings in the spring, let it sit, revised it, built it in the autumn, probably finished it just before he died without knowing that. The things a man builds, they outlast him and they hold what he intended for them, and then they go on holding. I don't know a better argument for building things carefully than that. I came to understand, over those winter weeks, something about the way Clara Aldridge was put together that I don't think I could have understood before I was the age I was. I was 47 that winter. You learn things by 47 that you couldn't have learned at 25, not because you're smarter but because you've been wrong enough times to know what being wrong feels like, and so when something is right you can tell the difference. What I could see was that she was not a woman who needed to be rescued. She'd walked a mile through a blizzard because she'd needed a lock opened, not because she was undone. She'd made a clear calculation who to go to, what to ask, how to ask it, and she'd executed it in difficult conditions, and she'd been right. The lock got opened. What she needed, and what I came to understand she was capable of naming for herself and asking for directly, was partnership. The specific thing she'd said at the kitchen table the night of the blizzard. Someone who'll come when I knock. Not to be led or taken care of. To have, in a hard country where you are trying to hold something together alone, one direction you can walk that isn't just white. I had been that, I think, for 9 years in the other direction. Walking north to my place, not south, not east, not anywhere in particular. Just circling my own ground. There's a particular usefulness in a man like me. I'll say that for myself, and I mean it as a plain statement rather than pride. I know how to work, and I know what work is worth, and I don't make it into more than it is. I know how to fix what's broken without making a monument of the fixing. I know how to be in a room with someone and not fill it up with myself, which is rarer than you might think. I know how to come when I'm needed and not come when I'm not. That is not a glamorous accounting, but it's the right kind for the right woman, and I've learned by 47 not to undervalue the right kind. I should tell you about the first Sunday supper, because it was not what I'd expected, and it was better. She'd said come for supper Sunday, and I'd said I would, and all the way down the road that evening, I was thinking about what the right behavior was at a supper that was different from the previous suppers, which had all been straightforwardly practical in their occasion. I'd been to her table maybe 6 or 7 times by then for working meals, and those had their own shape. You came in, you washed up, you sat down, you talked about what needed talking about, you left. But this was different in a way that she'd made clear and I'd acknowledged, and I didn't want to be obtuse about it. I brought wine. I am not a wine man, but I'd gone to Harlan's Ferry that day on a pretext, and I'd stood in front of the shelf at the general store for 5 minutes thinking about what wine means when you bring it to a woman, and then I'd bought a bottle that the man behind the counter said was from California and was decent. She looked at the bottle when I held it out, and then she looked at me, and the corner of her mouth went up a fraction. "All right," she said. We had beef stew and biscuits, and I opened the wine, and it was perfectly good, and we drank it with supper and talked. What I remember is not the specific things we said, but the quality of the time. The way it felt to be sitting at that table across from her, with the lamp between us and the window showing full dark outside, and nothing outside it that required either of us to move. A finished quality, like a circle that had come around to where it started. She asked me about Alina. I'll be honest, I wasn't prepared for that. Not because it was wrong to ask. It wasn't. It was the right thing to ask if she was going to understand what she was considering. But because nobody had asked me about Alina in probably 5 years, and I had to search back through something that had got quiet and find the words for it. I told her the true things. That Alina had been a practical woman with a good laugh and a talent for making difficult things seem ordinary. That she died too young, and that I'd spent some time afterward not quite knowing what I was for. That I'd come to Montana and built the place I'd built partly because I needed to be making something with my hands when I couldn't make anything else. That I'd been fine. That fine is a particular country, not a destination. Clara listened all the way through without filling in pauses. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "She sounds like she was good to you." "She was," I said. "That's a good thing to have had," she said, "and it's a good thing that you know it." I thought about what she meant by that, and I thought she meant that there are men who have been loved by good women and don't know it, can't recognize it when they have it, and then they lose it and still can't quite name what they've lost. She meant, "You're not that man." And she was right, I wasn't. I'd always known what I had with Alina. Knowing what you have and losing it anyway is its own kind of grief, but it's cleaner than the other kind. She told me about Reuben then. The same direct way she told me about Missouri, not asking for anything, just filling in the picture. They'd been suited to each other in the practical ways that make a frontier marriage work. He'd been a careful man and she'd appreciated careful. They'd been content, she said, which she said carefully and which I heard clearly. Not ecstatic, not the kind of love that makes good stories, but the kind that holds through winters and keeps accounts and builds cribs with good joinery. She said she would always be grateful for him. She poured the last of the wine and put the bottle down and said, "I'm not trying to replace something, is what I'm saying. I don't think you are either. I think we're both trying to build something that's actually itself." I said I thought that was right. She looked at me across the table. "Then we understand each other," she said. We did. June came back from the barn just now while I was sitting here thinking through how to finish this. She had hay in her hair and her boots were muddy, and she had the expression she gets when she's been doing something satisfying. She's 6 years old and she already has that look, the look you get when a thing is done right. "The sorrel's leg is better," she said. "We'd had a horse with a swollen fetlock all week." "Good," I said. She stood there looking at me, the way kids look when they're deciding whether to say something. "Papa," she said. She mostly calls me Papa now and has for a couple of years. "Why are you sitting inside?" "Fair question," I said. I was thinking. She considered this seriously, the way she considers things. "Mama says thinking is best done moving," she said. "She says sitting still thinking just lets the same thought go around." I said her mama was probably right about that. She looked satisfied and went back outside. Her mama is in the garden right now, or what will be the garden in a month when the ground firms up enough. She goes out there in the late afternoon and walks it, working out in her head what goes where. It's still brown and flat and you'd have to take it on faith that anything's coming. She takes it on faith. Every year she takes it on faith, and every year the thing she planted comes up, and I don't think it surprises her, exactly. It's more that she expected it all along and the growing is the confirmation. I'll go out in a minute. The sorrel needs to be looked at regardless of what June thinks, and there's a gate on the north pasture that's been dragging and I know what it needs. 15 minutes of work, maybe 20. And Clara will hear me coming around the far side of the barn, and she'll look up from the garden with her hand shading her eyes against the afternoon light, and she'll have that dirt on her hands, and that settled look she has when she's been working, and she'll look at me the way she looks at me. And I'll be the man she's looking at. That's the whole of it, I think. That's the whole accounting if you want to write it out. There are colder ways to spend a life and emptier, and I know because I was in one for 9 years. There is a particular loneliness to 400 acres when the only sound is the work you're doing, and the only opinion is your own, and the only direction home is north. I was fine. Fine is a place, like I said, but it's not a destination. It's a holding position while you wait for the weather to change. The weather changed in February in a blizzard, when a woman walked a mile and stood in my driveway and said my name, and I put on my coat and I went out. I'd do it again in a heartbeat. The cold, the broken padlock, all of it. The whole long year of careful work before anything was said. The first Sunday supper with the California wine. The barn in the dark, waiting. All of it. You get 1 or 2 moments in a life where the right thing to do is also the thing that changes everything. Most times you don't know it when you're in it. You're just doing what needs doing, what any decent man would do. Then you find out later what it was.